It was a quiet morning by the lake. The mist rolled across the still water, and the soft hum of birds filled the air. I stood on my porch sipping coffee, watching the reflection of the sunrise dance across the ripples. It was peace pure and simple, the kind you only get when you live far from noise and nonsense. That peace, however, never lasted long once the HOA president showed up. Her name was Deborah, but everyone around here called her Karen behind her back. She ran the neighborhood like it was her personal kingdom. No one parked without her permission, no one painted without her approval, and no one ever dared say no to her. Except me. I had bought my cabin years before the HOA even existed. My grandfather built it by hand before half of these houses were even thought of. So when the HOA formed and started spreading its rules around, I kept my distance. I didn't sign up, I didn't pay fees, I didn't attend their ridiculous meetings. That didn't sit well with Deborah. She came strutting up my gravel driveway one afternoon wearing her sun hat and clipboard like she was on official business. Her heels crunched against the dirt road, and her lips were pursed tighter than a knot. She didn't even greet me before she started talking. "You need to vacate this property immediately," she said with that fake politeness people use when they think they have authority. "This cabin sits within the Lakewood HOA district, and you are in violation of multiple property regulations." I raised an eyebrow and leaned on the porch railing. "Violation?" I asked. "You mean the cabin my grandfather built before your HOA was even a thought?" She blinked, clearly not expecting pushback. "Well, regardless of when it was built, it now falls under our jurisdiction," she snapped. "You can either comply with our rules or vacate the premises." I couldn't help but smile. She really thought her little printed rules mattered here. I invited her to take a seat, but she refused, preferring to stand tall like a guard at a gate that wasn't hers. She began listing off her so-called violations. Unregistered property structures. Unauthorized dock installation. Non-HOA approved exterior paint color. I listened quietly, letting her words drift off into the open air. When she was done, I walked inside and came back with an old folder covered in dust and worn edges. Inside were the original property deeds signed and sealed long before any HOA existed. I handed them to her gently and watched the color drain from her face as she read the first line. "This property and all adjoining lakefront access shall remain private and exempt from any future homeowner associations." She looked up, eyes wide. "This can't be right," she whispered. "It's very right," I said, smiling. "My family owns this land, the water access, and the lot your HOA thinks it controls." She stammered, flipping through the pages, trying to find some loophole, but there wasn't one. The law was clear, the boundary lines were drawn, and her power stopped 100 yards from my porch. Still, she wasn't ready to give up her little battle of pride. "We'll see about this," she said, clutching her clipboard like a shield. "I'll have the county review this immediately." "You do that," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Just make sure they bring my grandfather's signature when they come." Deborah turned on her heel and marched back down the drive. Her face red, her jaw clenched, so tight it looked painful. I could hear her muttering about respect and authority as she climbed into her shiny SUV and sped off. I chuckled to myself and went back to my coffee. The lake shimmered like nothing had happened at all. But I knew this wasn't over. People like her never walk away quietly. A few days later, a white truck with the HOA logo pulled into my drive again. This time it wasn't just Deborah. She had brought company. 2 men stepped out of the truck wearing matching polos with Lakewood HOA embroidered on the chest. They carried clipboards too, as if paper gave them power. Deborah followed behind them, her sunglasses perched high on her nose, her mouth set in a smug grin. She looked like someone who thought victory was already hers. "Good afternoon, sir," one of the men said with a forced smile. "We are here to perform a property inspection under the direction of the HOA president." Deborah folded her arms and nodded, as if she were the mayor of the county. I stayed calm. "Inspection?" I asked, "even though you have no authority here." The man cleared his throat, glancing nervously between me and Deborah. "Well, according to the HOA boundary records, this cabin appears within our management district. So we just need to verify compliance." I smiled, slow and steady. "You go ahead and verify whatever you like, but before you set 1 foot past that line, you might want to look over there." I pointed to the side of the drive where an old iron stake marked the true boundary. A faded sign beside it read in clear bold letters, "Private property, no trespassing, lakefront reserve." The man hesitated, his eyes shifting between the sign and the clipboard. Deborah, however, didn't budge. "That sign doesn't mean anything anymore," she said, her voice sharp. "The HOA has jurisdiction here now, whether you like it or not." I chuckled softly. "You ever check county records before making bold claims?" She frowned.
"Of course I have," she snapped.
"Then I guess you missed the part where this land isn't even zoned under Lakewood Estates," I said. "It's zoned under Lakefront Preserve, privately held since 1961. Her expression flickered. One of the inspectors shifted awkwardly and leaned toward her. "Ma'am," he whispered, "I don't think we're supposed to be here." But Deborah waved him off. "Do your job," she barked, stepping forward. Before she could take another step, a white SUV rolled down the road and stopped behind their truck. The sheriff stepped out, adjusting his hat and walking toward us, slow and steady. "Morning, folks," he said. "What's going on here?" Deborah turned to him with a triumphant smile. "Sheriff, I'm glad you're here," she began. "This man is refusing to comply with HOA regulations and is obstructing an official inspection." The sheriff looked at her, then at me, then back at her again. He sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from dealing with someone who causes problems weekly. "Ma'am, this cabin is on private land outside your HOA's authority," he said calmly. "County maps confirm that. You're the ones trespassing here today." Deborah froze. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The two inspectors quickly stepped back, clearly wanting no part of what came next. "Sheriff, I think there must be some mistake," she stammered. "The boundaries were extended last year, surely." "No, ma'am," the sheriff interrupted, still polite but firm. "Those boundary extensions stopped right at the ridge. This property has never and will never be under HOA jurisdiction." I leaned against the porch rail, watching her pride crumble. The sheriff tipped his hat toward me with a knowing grin. "Sorry to bother you, sir, just making sure everything's in order." "All good, Sheriff," I said. "Always nice to see the law respecting real ownership." He nodded, turned back to Deborah, and added, "Ma'am, I'd advise you to leave before I file a report for unlawful trespass." The color drained from her face. She glanced at her inspectors, who were already walking briskly back to their truck. Her voice cracked as she muttered something about misunderstanding and paperwork. I just stood there watching her drive off, her tires kicking up dust as her precious authority faded behind her. The sheriff laughed softly as he walked back to his SUV. "Some people never learn," he said, shaking his head. "You keep enjoying your lake, sir." I thanked him and watched his vehicle disappear down the road. The air grew still again, only the sound of birds returning to their morning routine. I took a deep breath, feeling that peace return. But deep down I knew Deborah wasn't done yet. People like her didn't accept defeat easily. She would be back. And when she came, she would bring more than clipboards and empty threats. Days passed quietly after that incident, but the peace felt temporary, like calm before a storm. Deborah's pride had taken a hit, and everyone in the nearby community knew it. Rumors traveled fast around Lakewood Estates, and from what I overheard at the diner, she was not handling her embarrassment well. She started showing up near my property, lying more often, pretending to be checking something on her phone. Sometimes she would stand by the road, just staring at the cabin with that tight smile that never reached her eyes. I could tell she was planning something. One afternoon, as I was fixing the old dock, I heard the rumble of an SUV pulling up again. Sure enough, there she was, stepping out in heels and sunglasses, flanked by two new men in suits. They looked more official this time, but I knew better than to be fooled by appearances. "Good afternoon," she said, her tone cold but controlled. "This time I have the proper paperwork," she added, waving a stack of documents in her manicured hand. I wiped my hands on my jeans and looked at her. "Paperwork for what?" "For the removal of unauthorized structures," she said, tilting her chin toward my dock. "According to new HOA environmental compliance policies, this dock violates preservation standards." I let out a slow breath, trying not to laugh. "You do realize this lake is under county jurisdiction, not the HOA, right?" She smiled, that kind of smile meant to provoke. "That's what you said last time, but things have changed," she replied confidently. The HOA board met last week and voted to expand oversight of this area. The two men with her nodded as if rehearsed. One held a folder marked official notice in bold letters. I took the papers from them and flipped through. Every page was stamped with the HOA seal, but something caught my eye. The legal description of the property listed a completely different parcel number. "This isn't even my land," I said, holding it up. "This document references a lot half a mile down the road." Her expression faltered for just a second before she caught herself. "Well, maybe it's an administrative oversight," she muttered. I chuckled softly. "No, Deborah, it's called trespassing with attitude." Before she could respond, a familiar sound came from the hilltop. A pickup rolled down the path and stopped beside us. Out stepped Sheriff Miller again, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Afternoon, folks," he said, nodding at me. "We got another complaint about boundary disputes. Care to explain?" Deborah's confidence wavered again. "Sheriff, I assure you this is an official inspection under the authority of—" He cut her off gently but firmly. "Ma'am, we've been through this already. County records have not changed, and this property remains privately owned by Mr. Walker. Unless you have a court order, this conversation is over." Her jaw tightened, and she turned red. "Sheriff, you don't understand. This man refuses to cooperate with community policies." The sheriff looked her dead in the eye. "Ma'am, he's not in your community." That simple sentence hit her harder than any argument could. The two men behind her shifted uncomfortably, as if they wanted to disappear. I folded my arms and waited. Finally, she huffed, turned on her heel, and stormed back to her SUV, slamming the door hard enough to echo across the lake. The sheriff shook his head and let out a low whistle. "Persistent one, ain't she?" "Persistent and wrong," I said, smiling faintly. He chuckled and tipped his hat. "You let me know if she tries this again. I'll file it as harassment next time." I thanked him and watched him leave. The water shimmered under the late afternoon sun, calm once again. But even as peace settled over the lake, I knew this wasn't over yet. Deborah wasn't the kind to surrender. She would dig deeper, twist rules, and call in favors. The HOA was her little kingdom, and she couldn't stand being powerless against someone who didn't bow to her authority. That night, as the moon rose over the lake, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the soft sounds of the woods. Somewhere out there, I could almost feel her anger growing like a storm waiting to break. But I had something she didn't: the truth and the law on my side. The next morning, the sun rose over the lake, casting gold ripples across the water. I was out on the porch sipping my coffee when a white envelope slid under my gate. No return address, no logo, just my name written in sharp, precise handwriting. I walked over, picked it up, and opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, an official notice from the HOA again. It claimed that all access roads leading to my cabin were now subject to association maintenance fees and restrictions. At the bottom was Deborah's signature, bold and proud. I almost laughed out loud. She really couldn't stop herself. I grabbed my truck keys and headed straight to the county office. The clerk behind the counter recognized me from last time and smiled. "Morning, Mr. Walker. What brings you in today?" "Seems the HOA president thinks she owns the roads now," I said, placing the letter on the counter. The clerk glanced at it, then frowned. "She can't do that. These are public easements owned by the county. And your private road isn't even registered under their jurisdiction." "That's what I thought," I said. Mind printing me an official map and boundary statement. Within minutes, I had the documents stamped and signed in my hands. Proof clear as daylight. By the time I drove back to the cabin, a small group of HOA members were standing at the end of my drive. Deborah was there too, clipboard in hand, issuing orders like a general before battle. "You can't block access to this area," she said as I parked. "We've decided to install a maintenance gate for safety purposes." I stepped out of the truck, holding up the county documents. "Install anything here, and you'll be violating public access codes," I said calmly. "This land, this road, and that dock are under county protection, not HOA jurisdiction." The small crowd of members exchanged nervous glances. A few of them started whispering to each other, their confidence fading fast. Deborah forced a smile, but her eyes were furious. "We'll see about that," she hissed, turning on her heel. Before she could walk away, I added one more thing. You might want to call off your lawyer before he embarrasses himself too. I already filed a complaint with the county. Next time you trespass, they'll be the ones calling you. That stopped her cold. She didn't turn around, but her shoulders tensed. For the first time I saw her pride waver, replaced by something that looked like doubt. She got into her car and drove off, leaving a trail of dust and silence behind. The other HOA members hesitated for a moment, then slowly followed her. I stood there for a while, watching the last car disappear down the road. The lake shimmered peacefully again. It was quiet except for the soft sound of water lapping against the dock. But I knew this wasn't the last I'd see of Deborah. People like her didn't accept defeat easily. And I could feel she was planning something bigger, something she thought would finally break me. But what she didn't know was that I had already prepared for it. That night the air was still, the moonlight stretching across the lake like a silver road. I sat on the porch listening to the crickets and the soft hum of the water hitting the dock. For a moment everything seemed calm, but my gut told me the calm wouldn't last long. Around midnight, a faint glow appeared through the trees' headlights, moving slowly up the trail. I set down my coffee and watched quietly. 3 vehicles rolled up, stopping just before my gate. One of them was Deborah's black SUV. She stepped out with a group of men I hadn't seen before. They wore reflective vests and carried heavy tools like they were here to dig or tear something down. She pointed toward the cabin and started giving orders, her voice echoing faintly in the night. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered under my breath. I walked down the steps and called out, "Deborah, what are you doing here at this hour?" She turned around, her face smug and confident again. "We're removing illegal structures," she said. "Starting with that dock you were warned twice and refused to comply." "Illegal?" I asked, holding back a laugh. "You mean the one registered with the county and approved 20 years ago?" She crossed her arms. "Not anymore," she said firmly. The HOA board voted unanimously that any structures affecting lake view aesthetics can be taken down. I shook my head slowly. "You don't learn, do you?" She smirked. "You'll learn once it's gone," she said, snapping her fingers toward the workers. Before they could move, I stepped closer and raised my phone. "Already recording everything. You might want to tell your crew to stop," I said. "Because in about 10 minutes the sheriff and county land management officer will be here." She laughed dismissively. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I replied, tapping my phone screen. The call log showed Sheriff Miller's name with a recent timestamp. Right on cue, the sound of tires crunching gravel filled the air. 2 sets of headlights appeared down the trail, followed by the flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the trees. Deborah's expression froze. The workers instantly stopped what they were doing. Sheriff Miller stepped out of his cruiser, followed by a tall man in a county jacket holding a clipboard. "Evening, everyone," he said in his usual calm tone. "Now, what's going on this time?" I gestured toward the dock. "Same problem, Sheriff. She's trying to tear down private property again." The county officer stepped forward, flipping through his paperwork. "Mr. Walker is correct," he said firmly. "This dock predates the HOA by decades and is fully protected under county property law." Sheriff Miller turned his gaze to Deborah. "Ma'am, I thought we discussed this." She stammered, trying to regain her composure. "Sheriff, this is a community action. We have board approval." The sheriff's tone hardened. "Board approval doesn't override the law, ma'am. You're trespassing on private land after hours with intent to destroy property. That's a criminal offense." Her face went pale. The workers started backing away, muttering to each other, and heading toward their trucks. The county officer began taking pictures, while the sheriff wrote down notes. I stood quietly, watching Deborah's power crumble piece by piece under the weight of her own arrogance. "You can't do this," she finally said, her voice cracking. "I'm the HOA president." "Not here, you're not," the sheriff replied coldly. "Here you're just another trespasser." Her hands trembled as she looked around, realizing everyone, including her own crew, was avoiding eye contact. She turned toward me, her voice barely a whisper. "You'll regret this." I gave a calm nod. "No, Deborah, you'll regret not knowing when to stop." The sheriff escorted her to her SUV and waited until the rest of the crew left the property. As the last tail light disappeared down the trail, the night grew quiet again. Sheriff Miller gave a small sigh and looked at me. She's done for now, but I wouldn't be surprised if she tried something through legal channels next. Let her try, I said with a tired smile. I've got every document, every recording, and every law on my side. He nodded and tipped his hat before leaving. The sound of his truck faded into the woods, leaving only the stillness of the night. I looked out over the lake, again the moon reflecting off the surface like glass. The water was calm, but I knew the fight wasn't truly over. Deborah's pride wouldn't let her rest. And neither would mine until she learned the truth about what real ownership meant. The next few days passed quietly, but the silence felt uneasy like the air before a storm. I went about my usual routine, fixing the fence, checking the boats, and keeping the property in shape. But deep down I knew Deborah was planning something new, something she thought would finally win. I didn't have to wait long to find out. By the end of the week, a certified letter arrived in my mailbox. Inside was a formal notice stamped with HOA letterhead claiming that my property was now under review for zoning violations. It stated that a complaint had been filed to the county claiming my cabin was built too close to the waterline and violated safety regulations. I almost laughed out loud, but then I noticed something else. The complaint wasn't signed by Deborah directly. It was filed by an environmental law firm out of state. She had brought in outsiders. I knew this was her biggest move yet, so instead of reacting, I drove to the county office again. The clerk recognized me immediately and rolled her eyes with a smile. Let me guess, HOA trouble again. You guessed it, I said, handing her the papers. She read through them slowly, then shook her head. This firm has no jurisdiction here, she said. They filed it under the wrong environmental code. It doesn't even apply to residential property. I smiled and leaned forward. Mind printing me an official statement confirming that. She grinned. Already on it. Within minutes, I had everything I needed, including a signed statement from the county engineer verifying that my cabin met all building standards. That afternoon, I stopped by the local diner, where a few HOA members were sitting at the counter talking quietly. When they saw me walk in, they all went silent. I knew word of the new complaint had already spread. Morning, gentlemen, I said, setting the envelope down on the counter. You might want to take a look at that before Deborah drags your names into another mess. One of them hesitated, then opened it, reading carefully. His eyes widened as he looked at the official seal. This says her claim is invalid, he said quietly. Completely, he added, handing it to the man beside him. Exactly, I said, smiling. So next time she holds one of her secret meetings, tell her to bring her facts, not her attitude. They didn't say a word as I left, but I could feel their trust in Deborah cracking. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed her SUV parked near the trail again. She was standing outside with her phone pressed to her ear, pacing back and forth. Her voice was low, but I caught enough to understand she was furious. You told me it would work, she said into the phone. I don't care what the county says, there has to be another way. She turned sharply when she saw me and hung up. Her expression twisted between anger and desperation. You think you've won, she said, stepping closer. But this isn't over, not until you leave this place for good. I looked at her, calm and steady. Deborah, I've told you before, this land isn't yours to control. And the more you fight it, the deeper you dig your own hole. Her jaw tightened. You don't belong here, she snapped. This lake was meant for people who care about order, not stubborn men clinging to old rules. I took a slow breath. Maybe the problem isn't the rules, Deborah. Maybe it's that you think they only apply to everyone else. For a moment, she didn't speak. Her face flushed, and her hands trembled slightly. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed off down the trail, disappearing into the trees. I stood there for a long while, listening to the sound of her SUV fading into the distance. The lake was calm again, but I knew this wasn't the end. Deborah had lost too much pride to quit now. And somewhere deep down, I could feel she was about to make one last desperate move to take everything from me. The following morning, the sky was gray and heavy, the kind of sky that made the lake look darker than usual. I walked down to the dock with my coffee in hand, watching the fog drift over the water. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Then I heard it, the distant rumble of engines. I turned and saw 3 county trucks slowly making their way down the dirt road toward my cabin. Behind them was Deborah's black SUV once again. I set my cup down and waited as the vehicle stopped near the gate. Out stepped several men in work jackets carrying surveying equipment and clipboards. Deborah climbed out last, her face set with that same smug confidence I'd seen too many times before. "Morning, Mr. Walker," she said in a tone dripping with false politeness. "We're here on behalf of the county to perform an environmental reassessment." I looked at her, then at the men with her. "Funny," I said, "because I just spoke with the county engineer 2 days ago, and he didn't mention any reassessment." She smiled thinly. "You must have missed the new order," she said. "This area is under temporary review for waterway compliance, and we've been authorized to inspect all nearby structures." I crossed my arms. "Authorized by who exactly?" She gestured toward the man beside her. "By Mr. Harris," she said confidently. "He's from the State Environmental Office." The man gave a polite nod, but his eyes avoided mine. Something about him didn't feel right. He looked uncomfortable, like he knew he wasn't supposed to be here. "Mr. Harris," I said evenly, "would you mind showing me your state identification before you begin?" He hesitated. "Well, actually, I left it in the truck," he said awkwardly. "Of course you did," I replied quietly. Before Deborah could respond, another sound broke through the morning air. The sharp growl of an engine approaching fast. A familiar pickup came into view, dust swirling behind it. Sheriff Miller stepped out again, adjusting his hat as he walked toward us. "Morning, everyone," he said slowly. "Seems I've been getting a few calls about unauthorized inspections around the lake." Deborah's smile vanished. "Sheriff, this is a legitimate state action," she said quickly. "These men are here under my coordination to verify compliance." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Under your coordination," he repeated. "You don't have the authority to coordinate with state departments, ma'am." He turned to the man she called Mr. Harris. "Sir, can I see your credentials, please?" The man sighed and reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. The sheriff took one glance at it and frowned. "This isn't a state ID," he said flatly. "This is a private consulting license from an environmental group in another county." The silence that followed was thick. Deborah's face went pale, her mouth opening, but no words coming out. Sheriff Miller handed the paper back. "Ma'am, you've officially crossed the line. You brought unlicensed contractors onto private land under false authority. That's fraud and trespassing combined." Her hands shook as she tried to speak. "Sheriff, I didn't know they weren't." "Yes, you did," I interrupted quietly. "You just couldn't stand losing, so you made up your own laws again." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Mr. Walker, I'm going to file this as an official incident report. And ma'am, I suggest you contact your lawyer, because the county won't take this lightly." One by one, the workers packed up their gear, clearly eager to leave. Even the so-called Mr. Harris avoided looking at Deborah as he climbed back into his truck. She stood there frozen, watching everyone leave. For the first time, her arrogance seemed to crumble completely. Her eyes glistened with the faint shine of tears, though she tried to hide them behind her sunglasses. I didn't say anything, I just watched as she finally turned back toward her SUV. She stopped for a moment, hand on the door, and said quietly, "You've made an enemy out of the wrong person." I replied calmly, "No, Deborah, I've just reminded the wrong person where the line is." She didn't respond. She got into her SUV and drove off slowly, the sound fading into the woods. The sheriff sighed and looked at me, shaking his head. "She's finished this time," he said. "The board's already tired of her, and now she's got legal trouble on top of it." I nodded, but my eyes stayed fixed on the road where she'd disappeared. I had a feeling she wasn't finished just yet. Pride like hers didn't die easily. And I knew before long she'd try one last move to take back the power she'd lost. Weeks passed, and the lake grew quiet again. The air was calm, the sunsets golden, and the sound of the water against the dock once more felt peaceful. I spent my days repairing the cabin roof, fixing the old fence, and sitting by the fire at night with a sense of comfort I hadn't felt in months. One afternoon, as I was stacking firewood, a white envelope appeared in my mailbox. No name, no return address, just a seal from the county courthouse. For a moment, I thought Deborah had filed another complaint. But when I opened it, I found something unexpected. Inside was a formal notice. It stated that Deborah Mitchell had officially resigned from the HOA presidency, effective immediately. Along with it was a signed statement admitting to falsified claims and unauthorized actions regarding private property inspections around the lake. At the bottom was a handwritten note in small, neat letters. It read, "I went too far, Mr. Walker, I'm sorry." I stood there for a long moment reading it twice. Then I folded the paper carefully and looked out across the water. The wind rippled through the pines, carrying the scent of pine and lake water. For the first time since this all began, there was no tension in the air. Sheriff Miller stopped by later that evening. He smiled when I showed him the letter. "Looks like she finally got the message," he said. I chuckled quietly. Yeah, I guess she finally realized she couldn't bully the landowner off his own land. The sheriff nodded and tipped his hat. "Enjoy your peace, John, you've earned it." When he left, I sat on the porch watching the sky fade from gold to deep blue. The first stars began to appear, and the lake shimmered under their light. I felt a quiet satisfaction deep in my chest. This cabin my grandfather built, this land that had been ours for generations. It was more than just property. It was family history, it was freedom, it was peace. As the night deepened and the crickets began their chorus, I leaned back in my chair, smiling softly to myself. Deborah was gone. The HOA had learned its limits, and the lake once again belonged to the quiet. To those who respected it. I took a deep breath and whispered to the wind, "Grandpa, we kept it safe." And the gentle waves against the dock felt like his answer.